older cousin came to stay. He wanted to canoe down the Whanganui River, and his father wouldn't let him, so he came to stay with us at Dawson Falls. He belonged to a band in Wellington. I think he might have started the band. He was wonderful with a pencil. He did all sorts of sketches. These are some of the ones he did, with the idea of making postcards out of them later, which his father had done earlier. After he'd been with us for a few days at Dawson Falls, he was given the opportunity to climb to the top of Mount Egmont with an experienced climber, which he did. And on the way he learned all about the mountain, all about the history of the mountain and what happened and how you could look across from the top to Ruapehu and Narahoi. And Dave Rawson, who'd taken him up there, told him how sometimes they camped on the summit and early in the morning the sunrise would light up on Ruapehu and Narahoi, and it was a wonderful sight. A day or two later, the whole idea got too much for him, and he wanted to climb to the top and watch the sunrise on Ruapehu. He knew very well that he wouldn't get my mother's permission, so he asked me if I would like to go with him to the top of Phantom's Peak and stay for the night. My mother had his assurance that we wouldn't go any further than Sime Hut, so we happily climbed to Sime Hut. There's a photo of Pip. It must have been just after we arrived at the hut, and he'd taken his gear off and he was outside the hut staring at the top and no doubt dreaming up ways of convincing me that we ought to go to the top that night. And then we've got 4 photos here that I must have taken of him just before he went, because they're taken in front of Sime Hut. The main peak is directly behind him and he's all geared up to go to the top, geared up to the extent that he thought he ought to be geared up, and of course which was quite inadequate for what lay ahead of him. As a kid, I was hugely impressed with the Alpine Club members who'd been very good to me and taught me all they knew. And I knew that night that the weather signs were not good. There was a cap over the mountain, the wind was rising, and we had, apart from all that, we had promised we would stay in Sime Hut. So I refused to go. Pip decided to go on, and I watched him climb up the main peak from Sime Hut and vanish into the crater. All the time the wind was rising, the cloud was thickening, and I was half excited, half scared, half worried. And I spent the night alone in Sime Hut. And the wind howled, and the hut shook and creaked and groaned, and a little kid's imagination ran riot. And after what seemed an age, morning came, and there was no sign of Pip. No sign of anybody except in my imagination I could see a body lying on the snow in the main peak. I left this note for him and Simon, "Dear Pip, I thought I had better run on down and tell Mum, so if you do arrive, just come straight on down and I'll take as much care as possible." I ran the whole way from the top of Phantom's Peak down to 2.5 miles to Dawson Falls. Came out of the bush and the first sight I saw was my cousin, Diana Matthews. She looked across at me and her mouth dropped open and she said, "Dick, what on earth's the matter?" And I burst into tears and I said, "Pip is missing." And that was the end of that. They found him 3 days later in Mungnui Gorge. And of course the saddest part of the whole thing was that if he'd done the Wanganui River trip that he wanted to do originally, he'd probably still be alive. But then his old father did what he thought was best. And the tragedy was that actually, while Pip was missing still, nobody hadn't been found. His old father arrived at Dawson Falls, and right in the middle of it, and immediately put on a pair of boots and went searching for his son. I think the biggest sorrow was for my own mother and for Pip's mother and father. Seeing your strong-minded mother collapse in tears, and your aunt that you'd also regarded as equally strong-minded, and your happy-go-lucky ex-pilot uncle who you loved, seeing him looking so drawn and tired and despondent. Those are the things that had the effect. The taking of risks is characteristic of the British race, but the taking of risks without a satisfactory reason savours of foolhardiness, commented the District Coroner, Mr. Kennedy JP, at Stratford yesterday at the inquest of the death of Philip Kenneth Harold Matthews, aged 19 years, an artist living in Wellington, who was killed on a fall on Mount Egmont on Tuesday of last week. There are sometimes exceptional circumstances where man has to go solo, but normally it is dangerous for anyone at any time. In my opinion, the accident happened in daylight, he continued. I think Matthews found when he arrived at the summit that conditions were not suitable for him to stay the night, and that he decided to make the descent again immediately. Matthews was on the right route down, emphasised Syme. There's been some misunderstanding about where the boy fell, but the fact that the axe was found on Mackie Rocks shows he was on one of the two recognised routes. He was not lost when he slipped. Constable Donahue said that he considered the injuries received by Matthews would have caused instant death.